Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second event in the alumni webinar series, Leaders Speak. I'm Molly Ashley, the Alumni Engagement Manager at Oxford Brookes, and I work in a development and alumni team in a marketing and communication directorate. We've been running the alumni webinars throughout the year and inviting our key alumni to share their stories. These have ranged from career journeys to taster sessions and book launches. This series focuses on 4 alumni leaders, and I'm pleased this afternoon to welcome Keily Blair. You'll have opportunity after our discussion to ask questions of Keily. So there's a question tab at the side of your screen if you'd like to pop your questions in there, and we'll address some of those questions, as many as we can, at the end. Keily works for an international law firm, Orrick, where she leads cyber and privacy practice. In her work, she navigates privacy and cyber security crises for clients and helps them better achieve commercial, regulatory and judicial outcomes. She's won the International Women in Law Award in 2017 and the Women in City Futures Leader Award in 2015. In 2015, she also founded Fractio Vitri, which means breaking the glass ceiling, which is a support group for women in business who are under 30 and work in the city. She also runs Orrick's firm-wide Women at Orrick peer mentoring scheme. As a self-confessed risk taker, Keely's willingness to embrace and taking risks has helped shape her professional and personal life. And we're here today to talk about the importance of taking risks. So welcome again, Keily.
Thanks, Molly.
It'd be great to start with, I suppose, a definition of this, a definition of what you mean by taking risks.
No, well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's really nice to be here today with you, Molly, and to talk about this really important topic. So what do we mean by taking risks? While risks can be both personally and professionally rewarding and beneficial, they don't occur in a vacuum, right? So you can't really benefit from taking risks unless they're actually educated risks. Taking a risk, it's by itself, without understanding the nuances, the challenges, is reckless, and frankly, it's doomed to failure. So it's really better when we're talking about risk to think about calculated risks rather than just risks. So for me, a calculated risk means taking the steps to inform yourself about all of your options before assessing them, looking at the possible downsides, and frankly, being willing for those downsides to occur, and then looking at the possible upsides. So what are the potential rewards as a result of your risk taking? And then for me, it's about putting steps in place to mitigate or control the risk wherever possible. So Molly, you'll remember when we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit, actually used an analogy of your son getting on a motorbike, because I think Molly's got a young son and she was thinking about, oh my goodness, I'd never want him to take a risk of getting on a motorbike. And we talked a little bit about actually that kind of risk taking can be mitigated. So you can know the route you're about to take, you can buy a good motorcycle, you can wear a helmet, you can wear protective gear, you can assess it and think, actually, will the reward from me getting on a motorbike outweigh the risk of a potential injury? And everybody's appetite towards taking risks is different, but it's that intelligent risk taking, that calculated risk taking, that's really important when we're talking about risk.
Yeah. What do you think? Is there a difference between men and women and taking the who would more likely take risks? What do you think around that topic? I mean, obviously, I talked a bit about my son and typical motorbikes and boys. And do you think there's a difference more that men are more likely to take risks, and what the reasons behind that, or are things changing?
No, well, I think it's really interesting actually talking about gender and risk taking. I think almost before we go into that, though, is thinking about why does it matter? Why are we even talking about risk taking, right? Why is it important? And I think it's really interesting actually when you look at how risk taking is perceived. So if we think about it, if we don't take risks, essentially we just stay in our comfort zone, right? We don't ever really stretch or learn or grow. And undoubtedly, taking risks presents unforeseen opportunities. So I look at myself in my own personal life, and I know that one of the risks I actually took in my life was deciding to go to Oxford Brookes. I'd never visited Brookes. I'd never actually even been to England before. I grew up in Ireland, and the opportunity arose for me to study at Brookes, and taking that calculated risk ended up actually setting my life on a very particular path, and actually resulted in me ending up living in the UK rather than moving back to Ireland. But if I just stayed in my comfort zone and stayed in Ireland, that would never have happened. That was a road I would never have taken. And so as well, the other thing that's important about taking risks, it demonstrates confidence and it helps you to stand out from your peers. And we learn when we take risks that they lead us on new and important paths of self-discovery. I think one of the interesting things for me when we talking about gender and women in particular around risk and success is there's this great analogy called tiara syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, but it's the idea that sometimes women are brought up to think that if I continue to just do what I'm told and be good, and I wait, someone will come and put the tiara on my head and say, good job, well done. And that's just unlikely to happen, right? So we learn that actually by taking risks and by pushing ourselves outside our comfort zone, we're much more likely to succeed. But then the question for me is, right, okay, let's talk about women and men. Is there a gender difference? So I think it's really important to think actually not necessarily is the answer. So at a population level, women tend to display a slightly different risk-taking profile compared to men. But at an individual level, there are huge variances in terms of risk-taking preferences. But nonetheless, women are perceived to be more risk-averse, right? I think if you asked 100 people in a room, do you think men or women take more risks? They would say men take more risks than women. But that also means that women are actually at a disadvantage when it comes to getting support for risk-taking. So we see this, for example, in venture capital all the time. And in fact, there have been certain funds that have been created specifically to fund ideas and ventures by women, because there is sort of a bias, frankly, a perception bias that women are not good risk takers and therefore not worth investing your money in that sense. And so this compounds the actual inclination towards less risk taking, right? Because if you get less reward and it's less recognized and you're penalized for not taking risks, or that's the perception, you can see that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's some super articles on the Harvard Business Review actually about this. So I'd highly recommend that to anybody who's particularly interested in the subject.
Very interesting. Yeah. So if there's no scientific basis for the stereotype, you think? So there's actually, do you think there's anything around that, around this, any science behind it?
Well, it's really interesting actually, because there's been less research done on women as risk takers, and frankly that's often because of this perception that women don't take risks quite as often as men do. So women's excessive caution, if it exists at all, I would say is actually often down to nurture rather than nature. And it's interesting when we talk about the nature and the biology and the science behind risk taking. A lot of that focus has been on research into the impact of testosterone on risk taking actually. And obviously, women have testosterone, but less than men. And testosterone correlates to aggression and certain risk-taking behaviors, but it's not predeterminative. It's not a guarantee that you will necessarily have a man who is more inclined to be a risk taker than women. And also, such behaviors may be very different in different domains. So women may be willing to take a risk in one domain, but not in others. So financial investing is one that's often cited. And it's seen that sort of men are more willing to invest in the stock market, for example, than women. Women are much more likely to take on lower risk financial investments, and therefore they get lower rewards as well. So it's very interesting in that sense, but it's not universal across the piece. It's not, less risk averse in every sense and more risk averse in others. There's also a trade-off between how men and women perceive risk differently and how they define risk-taking behaviors. And again, it's the point that risk-taking behaviors by women are generally just less studied, frankly. So there isn't that rich set of data in relation to risk-taking in women. But one thing that I found that was really interesting when I was looking at this topic was actually that stress actually really amplifies the difference in risk-taking in men and women. And so in particular, that what they found is that in men, in a stressful situation, and the male brain reacts in a very different way to the female brain. And actually men are more inclined to be reckless in a stressful situation and more inclined to take a risky decision. Women are more inclined to do nothing, actually. So we freeze. And it's really interesting. So they did some MRI scans and looked at the brain's reaction to risk-taking behavior and stress in particular. And this made the divergence greater between men and women and their response to risk. So I think that's very interesting to think, okay, well, so in a stressful situation, what's likely to happen? Who's likely to take more risk and who's not? Probably the man in that situation rather than the woman. So I thought that was quite interesting, actually, as a difference.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, the I haven't, obviously read more that's around the topic, but I wouldn't have thought that would be the case in those sort of extremes. So that's really interesting. What do you think about leaders then, and being risk takers? Do we really need more leaders who take those risks? There's probably a mixture of opinions listening, and whether you think of the risk as a positive or a negative. What is it that we need from our leaders? Why do we need them to be able to take risks? Do we?
Well, it's a great question, isn't it? And I think I remember back in 2008 when the financial crisis happened, there was a lot of talk of whether it would ever have happened if it was Lehman Sisters rather than Lehman Brothers. And we look at reactions from leaders of countries to the pandemic and the challenges presented by COVID-19. But it's interesting how we look at risk in that way. Again, it's calculated risk. It's thinking about, do we need leaders that take calculated risks? And I would say yes, we do. And it's interesting because when you actually think about the steps taken by someone like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, she actually took a risk in terms of making the decision that she did. Now her risk was to act particularly early and to put in place very strict restrictions in terms of travel and free movement within New Zealand. But that fast mover, making a quick decision and taking a risk that was not universally applied, actually, and actually a lot of other countries adopted more of a wait and see attitude, has really paid off in that case in relation to COVID-19. But if you ask people, do you think that she took a risk? They would say no. They would perceive her actually as not being a risk taker, when in fact she took a decision that was much more extreme than some of the decisions taken by other leaders. So I do think it is very important for leaders to take risks. And without trial and error and risk taking, organizations, countries, and institutions, frankly, just remain stagnant and quite predictable. But the key thing is about leaders discovering their own risk tolerance. Right, so understanding what risks they are willing to take, being focused on outcomes and rewards, and learning from mistakes. I think that's one of the harder things, certainly in relation to leadership, is that when you fail quite publicly sometimes. So that can be quite difficult, I think, in terms of risks and leadership. And I don't think there's any one size fits all, right? Because there's certainly leaders who follow a very linear path and aren't perceived as risk takers, who can be very successful too. It really depends on the organization and the country as well, in my mind.
So the benefits to organizations for hiring risk takers is that they make quick decisions, or what would you say around that? The benefits. Well, I presume you've got hiring panels, and you've got that. You'll be listening out to that, or making some of the interview questions around how people interpret risk. There might be something around that, isn't there, for senior leaders when you're hiring them? And what are the benefits, would you say?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And actually, the reality is you wouldn't want a team of all risk takers, right? I think companies actually benefit from diversity. They benefit from employees who are willing to take risks to achieve great outcomes, but they also need people who are going to support employees in taking those risks. You need to have a mix of both, frankly, and appropriate structures and support in place for both types of thinking. In terms of the benefits of hiring a risk taker, we talk about, certainly in tech, we talk a lot about sort of move fast and break things as being a way of getting things done and a way of innovating. But if everybody does that, that's very dangerous and everything gets broken. So it really is about getting that balance right in terms of innovation, diversity of ideas, making sure that you pair your risk takers with people who will perhaps inject a little bit more caution, inject a little bit more process into it. You don't want homogeny in terms of ideas and approach. I think that's when we talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's one of the things that we talk about a lot, actually, is not just diversity in terms of a specific diverse category of individual, but diversity of thought and approach. So making sure that you do have people who are risk takers in your team, but also those who are more cautious, people who are sort of completer finishers, people who will follow a task through, or people who generate ideas. The problem is if you have all of one or all of the other, you actually end up in a place where you don't really achieve very much. So there is a real benefit of hiring risk takers, but you wouldn't want a team entirely of risk takers, I don't think. I don't think it would be very productive.
No, that yes, that would be, I can see you need that sort of, those people that work together, and the more hesitant people, in in Brooke's teams, you can see that as well, that you need those people that push forward, and then the people, well, what about this, what about that? And it's very important. What about on the other side of it? You mentioned earlier about failing and publicly failing, failing. Is that sort of something that is important to businesses and to sort of risk takers, or is that important to be able to see that you failed once, and that you can brush yourself off and continue, life continues? And what about around the failure sort of theme? Is that important as well, do you think?
Well, I think it has to be, right? Because the reality is, if you are going to engage in a behavior that, or engage in business decisions that involve a degree of risk, there is a risk of failing. And it's about understanding what, for my mind, when I'm faced with a decision that I'm trying to analyze, I always try and say to myself, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? Number one. And then the second part of that question is, and how likely is that to happen? Because if you get stuck on the first part of that question, you can actually become paralyzed and not move forward in terms of taking risk and fear of failure. But it's really thinking about, okay, well, is it really likely? Okay, worst thing that could happen, I could lose my job, I could ruin the company, I could do this, I could do that. Is that really likely to happen? Is a very different question. And the answer is usually no. I always, whenever I worry about failure, which I think everybody does, right? I think anybody who is in a leadership position or who has to take decisions that involve acting on imperfect information sometimes, I always think about the Theodore Roosevelt speech, the Citizen in a Republic speech. Do you know that one, Molly? Is that one that you're familiar with?
Remind me.
No, I can remind you. So yeah, I'm such a nerd, right? I used to have a poster of this speech in my office, because I love it so much. And it's also called the Man in the Arena speech. So I'd again highly recommend to anyone to look it up. But essentially, it goes like this: it says, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or how the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who actually strives to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, and who knows at the end of triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." And I think for me, I'm always like, if I fail, at least I've tried. And being willing to fail and being willing to take a risk, I find is publicly, it's very empowering for your team, and it can really actually help people around you to also become calculated risk takers, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, the breaking it down as well. What on a small front can, people have this massive thing in their mind about, it's going to life finish, if that happens, but break it down so it's what's the worst, but what's the probable, which isn't half as bad as you think. That's a good tip. So being a calculated risk taker, how would you suggest to become one? What are the sort of small steps if you're thinking you've been, your style has been too comfortable and you'd like to be more reactive and more pushing forward? Is there sort of something you could, how you could move a little bit that way and take some small risks? What would you advise from your personal situations and experience?
I know how I take risks. So I think finding the creative edge is it's both an art and a science. I think there is no exact model for any individual in terms of how they can take risks. There's lots of great material in terms of how to become a calculated risk taker. I guess probably my two favorites I would recommend. So in my personal life, I really like Brene Brown's Daring Greatly. And that's a fantastic book on taking risk as an individual, as a person, as a parent as well. Actually, it's really, really great book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And then in my professional life, I've used the sort of Doug Sundem's Taking Smart Risks, which I think is really excellent as well. It provides sort of a framework that helps you to analyze risks in a business context. But if you're ever thinking, okay, actually, I have a decision I need to take and I need to try and assess the risk, you can't actually go wrong with a really simple SWOT analysis. So frankly, just, to get a piece of paper, divide it up into the 4 quadrants and look at it and think, okay, well, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats posed by this decision? And write them down, frankly. and get really granular in terms of that. And if you can do it on a page, it really helps you to understand the nature of the risk that you're facing. And I think probably the only thing I would say then as well, and this is a real lawyer problem, is kind of avoiding analysis paralysis, which is when you kind of keep picking at trying to get more information, so you can be perfectly informed before taking any decisions. And the reality is actually that's not always possible. And sometimes you do have to rely on your gut a little bit and rely on intuition. So I think the simple SWOT analysis can be great to sort of help inform your gut, but you can keep going and going and going. And at some point, you've just got to say, okay, right, I have enough information now to move forward. I'm comfortable that I understand the nature of the risk I'm thinking about taking and that I understand the potential upsides and downsides.
Yeah, I think that I can see that happens in organisations. Too much thinking, and then you miss the moment because there's a timely piece, isn't there? You around it, and so I can understand that. I can see that happens, in organisations. So that's interesting. The SWOT analysis, that's a good tip. We should collect these resources for everybody at the end, because you're mentioning some great resources. What about how would you, I mentioned, and we've talked about your mentoring and the work you do with the women's group and in Orrick as well. How do you, if people come to you and say, I want to be a risk taker, more of a risk taker? I mean, you said about the SWOT analysis. Is there anything else, and how do you encourage them, sort of emotionally, to do it? Is there any tips?
No, I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think there's sort of 4 things that I think are really important when you think about how to encourage others to take risks. So the first thing I would say is modeling. So that's the idea of actually modeling risk-taking behavior yourself. So if employees see their leaders and their managers being willing to take chances and push themselves, and they gain comfort in their own ventures. So basically it's about creating a risk-taking culture where people recognize the importance of taking calculated risks, don't go crazy, calculated risks in the workplace and in relation to themselves and their personal lives, and pushing themselves in that way. I think the second thing that people need to do to really encourage people is to enable them. So that's basically provide the tools and the information that employees need to make the right decisions, to help them to calculate the risk. So help people work through their SWOT analysis, help them to make decisions, recommend books, recommend articles that you've read, help to inform them, and give them permission to ask questions, I think is really important. And then the third thing that I think is really important when looking at encouraging others to take risks is about providing a supportive environment. So basically, you need to support your employees and your team members, frankly, if you want them to take risks, because they need to feel like they can take a risk and risk failing, frankly, and know that that will be okay. And so verbalizing that thing of, I support what you're doing through your words and through your actions, and by doing that sort of support and enablement, I think that's really important around encouraging people to take risks and doing that way. And then finally, the last thing I would say is consistency, Molly. Like, I think that's the thing. Not seeing some people in your team as the risk takers and some people not as the risk takers, and sort of pigeonholing people in boxes like that. I think it's just really important that people feel constantly supported, and that they feel that they're in an environment where they will be supported by their leaders if they take risks. So leaders also need to stay strong and positive, and be willing to embrace the failures that come with innovation and risk taking. And I think the other thing I would say as well is it's about also recognizing when things aren't working and pulling the plug on things. I think that's something that actually I think a lot of people struggle with. It's that sort of doubling down into something as we've committed to it. But actually, if you get down a course and you realize, actually, do you know something, this isn't going to work, accepting that quickly and understanding and learning from that failure, I think is really important. But you'll only do that if you feel confident and secure, frankly, in terms of your management and the people around you, and that they genuinely have your back in the event that your ideas don't work out, right? That's the hardest thing, because I think that's what people worry about. We talked about that sort of fear of failure and how that can really paralyze people in terms of taking action. It's all about feeling like that's okay. It's okay for it not to work out. But, you actually need to live that. You can't just say it. It has to be true.
Yes, yes. No, I can see that. I mean, also the pigeonholing, thinking somebody might be able to be the risk taker and someone isn't, but to to give other people opportunities in the team to take those risks as well, and that support network, is important. So I suppose it's setting up that environment from the top, really, isn't it? I was as we're talking, I was thinking, when did you start taking risks? Can you remember when you started? You said coming from Ireland to Brooks, and that was a big risk. Is there other big points where you had made some risks, that you took some risks or you think it's just constantly part of your nature that you take them now, or you take a few and then you think, well, that I survived that. I can continue.
Yeah, it's a bit addictive. I think it can sort of like snowball a little bit, the risk taking. Well, I think it, for me, it has been. I think at school, actually, I was quite a good girl. Didn't take too many risks. Didn't really stray too much outside the box. And actually, it was moving country and being somewhere else and realizing that actually that was a good decision, and I was pleased with how that had worked out. And I think the more risks you then take. So when I then applied for a job at a firm that I thought was way better than I was, frankly, and I didn't have the confidence to do it, but I kind of made myself put the application in, and when I got the role, I remember feeling absolutely ecstatic and over the moon, but also terrified that I was going to fail. And I remember my first day feeling exactly the same way as well. And it's the same sort of throughout your career. You kind of get presented sometimes with these opportunities, and I do think that you kind of get confirmation bias eventually that actually taking risks, it is beneficial, and it does push you outside your comfort zone, and it does mean that you get recognized, I think, because you are willing to do things that other people aren't willing to do, and you're willing to take a chance. Maybe it won't work, but at least you've tried. Yeah. And I think that that's really good. But I think also I've had a lot of support from other people. So that's why I think that it's, when I talked a bit about actually how do you encourage other people to take risks, for me, that's central, because if I didn't feel like I was able to take risks and able to fail, I'm not sure I ever would have taken risks in the same way. So I think when we look at kind of our roles as managers, or as leaders of teams, or even as parents and friends, frankly, being a person who encourages others to take risks and to push themselves and creates that sort of safe space is really important, actually, because it's what moves everybody forward. And having someone say, okay, well, I believe in what you're doing. I think that's great. Let me know how I can support you and what can I do to help. It is really powerful, and it really, I think, gives people the confidence to take risks themselves. And it's often where you find the greatest rewards, frankly, in terms of doing things. I know that for me, about 5 years ago, I made a decision to change the area of law that I was practicing, and I had been a white collar lawyer for a long time, doing investigations work, and I got an opportunity from a very great mentor and friend of mine who I was working with at the time, to do data protection and cybersecurity work. And again, that thing of, oh my God, I'm a little bit terrified because it's outside my comfort zone. I've done one thing for so long and done another thing for a little while less time. So it's thinking, okay, being in that position and being willing to take that risk has been hugely beneficial for me in terms of my career, and it's put my career on a different trajectory that I've really enjoyed and really value now. And can't imagine doing anything else now. So I think that's, now another risk comes, another opportunity comes along like that, I might have to turn it down because I really enjoy it. But it definitely, for me, certainly, I found that taking risks has really paid off personally and professionally, which is why I kind of advocated so much. I think, playing it safe is fine, and I think, but actually, one of the things that struck me this year, Molly, and one of the reasons why when we talked about topics for today, one of the reasons why taking risks was so important to me is actually I've seen a lot of people have to take risks at the moment in terms of their careers, because the world of work is not what it used to be. Things are changing. The office of tomorrow, or the office of June, whenever we're able to go back, will be very different to the one that we left a year or so ago. Certain jobs won't exist, certain sectors are changing. And so by virtue of, frankly, an event that's been outside of all of our control, a lot of us have had to take different decisions around career paths and have had to take risks that we might not otherwise have taken. And so I think that's why, particularly for me at the moment, when I look around, I think it's really important for people to think, okay, well, if I'm going to take risks, how do I become a better risk taker? How do I become a more calculated risk taker? And when we see others doing it, how can we better support them?
Yeah, I think that's true. This year has been such a big change for lots of people. I mean, not for everybody, but for lots of people having to rethink where they're going, how to make a living, even, and quite a lot of entrepreneurial startups, haven't there? And I suppose that leading on to me thinking, as an entrepreneur, would you be an automatic risk taker? Maybe you would be.
I think so. I think you have to be an entrepreneur. Actually, I do think that there is, to be willing to back yourself in terms of new ventures, or to strike out on your own or to start your own business. I think absolutely entrepreneurship does require you to be a risk taker, and I think it again comes back to that thing about calculated risk, right? Understanding, okay, well, what's the potential upside, what's the potential downside, and being able to analyze it. But yeah, I do think absolutely entrepreneurs are definitely risk takers. Lawyers traditionally are not seen as risk takers. I mean, we're usually definitely on the more risk averse spectrum. I think in terms of you look at general professions, it's why our insurance costs apparently for car insurance is lower than a lot of other professions, because we're seen as being very safe pair of hands. So I don't know how I challenge that stereotype, I think, a little bit in terms of my risk taking. But I think and I don't tell my insurance company, obviously, because I would hate for my insurance to go up. But I think that's the reality, isn't it? Is that certain professions are seen as being more risk averse. Gender matters about being more risk averse. I think age plays a part as well. I think people are more likely to take risks when they're younger, and perhaps not always calculated risks, but certainly more likely to take risks when they're younger. As people get older or perhaps more settled, that changes things. Also, when you become a parent, your appetite for risk changes too, because obviously I think you worry more about children and family and impact and things along those lines when taking risks. So I'm not sure that anybody's risk appetite remains entirely static throughout their life. You ask the question of, have I always been a risk taker? I think at some times in my life more so than others, that's probably the answer to that question, in truth, because I think we all change and we all grow, and there's definitely external factors which influence how likely we are to take risks at any given time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's obviously financial things as well, how settled you are financially, taking changing jobs. It's quite a big thing, isn't it? Depending on stage of life, I can understand that. But I really like your you're talking about being an enabler, and not just in your career, in your professional life, but also in your personal life. That really rings true. That you as a friend, or if you're a mother or a father, and with your family, other family members, to be able to encourage that in a safe way, but in a positive way. Yeah, I know.
It's like when I see my children on the monkey bars, I'm always like, there's always that like innate part of me that wants to run over and be like, dear Lord God, please get off the monkey bars, not again. But also then there's that other part of you that sort of stands back and goes, no, okay, they know they've got this. Stand there and coach them through it and talk them through the experience. So put one hand in front of another, do this, do that. I'm here to catch you in case you fall. I think it's very interesting, isn't it, when you realize as a parent, you do that all the time with children. And certainly, I look at how I've got two little girls, and I certainly think, I'm always trying to encourage them to take risks. Sometimes my heart's in my throat when I do it, when I see them about to do something.
Not too many.
Oh God, please. But I think it really is. But it's also so empowering to see them do that, to see them grow and to see them challenge themselves. And you kind of think, okay, well, I want everyone, if everyone does that, if everyone was that way with all of their friends, all their family, all the people that we work with, I think we create such a positive environment in terms of innovation and change, and really giving us all of a much more satisfying work and life experience in that way. Because if we just stay within our comfort zone, that's fine, and it's called a comfort zone for a reason, but it's also quite restrictive. It stops us from growing, it stops us from changing and doing things and developing, and it can kind of become a little bit of a weird kind of comfort cage in that sense, I think, when we don't take risks and we worry too much about failing. You know, I think as well,
Yeah.
my eldest daughter is a bit of a tendency to be a bit of a perfectionist, and so it sometimes means that she doesn't try things that she doesn't think she's going to be good at, and that makes me really sad. So I kind of have to say to her, it's fine not to be good at something. It's fine for you to find it hard. Hard things are hard, but you know how to do hard things and you're good at them, so you'll get better at it if you keep practicing. So it is interesting. I think it really is pervasive in kind of every aspect of our lives, right? The idea of needing to take risks.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's interesting. I've picked up a lot from that. Maybe I need to take more risks.
Don't go out and buy a motorbike now, Molly, please.
In a calculated way. Tell my husband. It's great. It's really interesting, and you know, I wonder whether we've got some questions from the audience. I've got a few that have popped through. I said someone had mentioned about repeating. I don't think they missed what the name of the book was that you mentioned. I've just got very contracted messages here. I can't quite see all of them, but I think you mentioned a book. They were just quite keen for you to repeat that. But if we've got it, we've also got it all recorded so they can see that. So
no, that's fine. It's two books. So the one I mentioned was Brene Brown's Daring Greatly, which I think is wonderful, and then it's Doug Sundime's Taking Smart Risks. Was the sort of the professional one. So those two are really great. But there's a lot written about the subject of taking risks. So it's the other one I think that I really like. I can't remember who it's by, but it's called Adaptive Leadership. Which again is very, very interesting and very good too. So I would highly recommend those as, you know, bedtime nerd reading on taking risks.
Thank you. We've got a question here that's come through saying, thank you very much for the talk, really enjoying it. And he or she, I haven't got to the end of it yet, graduated from Brookes 2 years ago with a law degree. And let me just see. Graduate law degree. What advice would you give to a graduate who is looking to start a career in commercial law, and what risks should I be taking?
Good question.
Have you got any advice for him or her? I can't see the name, so sorry.
No, it's fine. Well, I think, you know, I think it's always interesting when you talk about career development and what risks you should be taking. So I think it's about understanding what are the organizations that you're going to be applying to, looking for, and again it's understanding, okay, well, how are you going to demonstrate that? And I think in terms of taking risks, I would say make contact with, you know, if you do identify organizations that you want to join, or law firms in particular that you're interested in joining. I'm going to regret saying this now out loud, but like I often get pinged on LinkedIn or things like that by people who are either, you know, looking at a career in law or looking at a career at Orrick in particular. So I would recommend, frankly, just get in touch with somebody from the organisation that you're particularly interested in joining. Ask them for advice. Ask them if they've got 5 minutes for a coffee, 5-10 minutes for a coffee. It's not as if any of us can go anywhere at the moment, right? So we're a more captive audience than we would perhaps otherwise be. And you'll be amazed, you know, people really are, in my experience, willing to take the time, but it requires you to reach out and do that. So the risk I would advise you to take is to do that, to identify the firms that you want to work at, and to make contact with a couple of individuals from those firms and try and pick their brains. They may just fob you off to graduate recruitment, some of them, but I think if you go for a couple of them, you might get lucky and you might get to have a really good conversation with somebody. I did that actually earlier on in the pandemic, and particularly I was worried about junior lawyers, because I think actually the learning experience is very different for junior lawyers at the moment than it would ordinarily be, where they're around partners all the time and sharing office space. So I kind of did a post on LinkedIn saying, oh, you know, I'm happy to talk to people. And I think I had about 35 different conversations with people from all over the country who were, you know, young lawyers, frankly, finding it a little bit tough at the moment. And it was really, really educational for me, frankly, as well, to understand a bit better how the junior members of the profession were doing during the pandemic, and to understand some of the challenges that they were facing. So I really would encourage you, person who we don't know your name, to make sure that you do reach out to people. You'd be surprised sometimes how willing people are to help.
Yes, thank you. That's a really good tip, and great to flag that you could answer some questions as well and offer some help. That's really lovely of you. We do have an e-mentoring scheme as well. Maybe I'll have to invite you on.
Happy to.
Just to say to the audience, if you've got any other questions, if you put them in the chat, I've just been asked to remind you to put them in the chat on the right hand side of your screen. So we've got one other question here from, who's it from? I can't see who it's from, sorry. Anyway, and the message is, given that surgeons are seen as risk takers and have a lot of power, how does that sit with our increasing expectations of that there should always be a positive outcome, I suppose, to surgery? And how do you teach this?
I think that's a difficult question. Yeah, very specific question.
But I think that's quite specific.
I do think so, but it's interesting when you talk about surgeons, because surgeons are probably very calculated risk takers, right? If you think about how long they study and how many times they will perform a specific surgery, they absolutely will be calculated risk takers, but they may need to make quick decisions if something goes wrong. So again, it's thinking about, okay, well, what's the framework for making risk-based decisions? How do you do that? And I think I know that certainly when I'm doing sort of cyber crisis work and I have to make decisions quickly on less information, I do rely on my gut instinct quite a lot and my past experiences to dictate what I'm going to do in that particular scenario. So I think in terms of when we talk about how do you teach that? You teach how to assess risk and you teach how to assess risk quickly. So when we talked earlier on about creating a framework for making good decisions, it's kind of becoming reflexive in doing that and thinking in the moment, how quickly can I make that decision and what information do I have in order to help me? What do I know from my past experiences that will help me to make this decision and make a good one? In terms of managing for downside risk and how do you manage that with thinking about expectations of a positive outcome? I think realism is important. When we talked about how managers and people can support people who take risks, you do have to recognize that, and as with any surgery, I'm sure that the individual who is undergoing surgery gets a briefing beforehand from the surgeon that says, this is a risky procedure or not a risky procedure, and here are the possible side effects, and here's what could happen. It's just sometimes we don't listen, I think, as well as the problem. If we want to hear one thing, it's that confirmation bias of thinking, okay, well, there won't be a negative outcome. But I suspect that before that individual went into the operating theatre, they probably had actually a briefing on the risks associated with whatever procedure they were going to have. It's just that we can't always manage for the downside.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite specific surgery, isn't it? Because it's obviously life or death often. But yeah, no, that's interesting. I've got a few more questions here, which is good. How often does a company need to review their risk assessment? Failing to review or ignore the technology changes can be detrimental to the organisation in the long term, etc. For example, Nokia and Kodak. How often do companies need to review their risk assessments, would you say?
Well, it's interesting. So you cited, two organisations that perhaps didn't innovate quickly enough, essentially, and as a result, their products became less in demand, frankly. So I think it's about always, it's that point about comfort zone again. I think both of those organisations are very well established brands who had a long history of doing what they were doing and had been very successful. I think what was different is that the people and the organisations around them were taking risks and were innovating. So actually, they're very good cautionary tales of why it is important to look at performance and look at risk. I think it's not something you can say, well, okay, you should do it every month, or you should do it every 3 months, or every 6 months. I suspect that you should always be looking around you, frankly, to see what your competitors are doing, what other organisations are doing, how they're changing, how they're innovating. You should always be constantly challenging yourselves to think, okay, well, how can I do this better? So it should more be, I think, rather than something that's, rather than like an annual audit of my risk appetite, which I know some companies do, and certainly in relation to specific issues. So in cybersecurity, for example, we talk a lot about what a company's risk appetite is, and we often set that on an annual basis. You will sit down and be like, okay, well, are we still on a scale of very risk averse to willing to take willing to carry a lot of risk? Where do we sit within that, and what investment decisions do we make on that basis? It's almost more constant than that. It is more fluid in many respects in terms of overall operational and strategic risk, and understanding that.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. I have another question for you. There were lots of students with you at Brooks, and not everyone is successful. What's made you different, apart from the risk taking?
Gosh, well, number one, thank you. That's very kind of you, whoever said that, making me blush. But I think success is not easy to define, right? And I don't think that we should ever look at people and just think that one type of public success is success. I saw a really interesting infographic recently where it said, a lot of people perceive success to be how much you get paid and what your job title is. That's it. And actually, success is a much more holistic thing, which involves, yes, what you get paid and what your job title is, perhaps, but also, are you happy in your family life? Are you mentally well? Have you got good friends and people around you who you care about? And success is a much more dynamic concept, I think, in that way. So I don't think I'm a special and unique unicorn in any way, shape, or form. I think that, like most people, there's areas of my life that I struggle with, and there's areas of my life that I excel in. And I think it's frankly leaning in sometimes to the things that you excel in, and recognizing the areas that you perhaps need a bit more work on, and perhaps need a bit more practice in. None of us are perfect, and I don't think there's anything in particular that would mark out me as being any more successful or less successful than other people I was at Brooks with. I think it's very hard to try and assess people in that linear way. I think one of the things I would always encourage everybody to do is to run your own race. Like there's no single definition of what success is. It really is different for everybody. And there'll be times when I'm stuck in my home office here, sitting in front of a computer at 11 o'clock at night. And for some people, that's definitely not the definition of success. They're going, that person is a crazy person and should have finished work a lot longer ago, and that wouldn't make them happy. It just so happens that it's something that makes me happy, and it gives me drive and ambition, and it's different in that way. So it's, I guess, run your own race is probably the best thing I could say to anybody, and think about what success means to you, and then put in the hard work necessary to achieve that. But it doesn't come without risks of failure too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I was writing the overview of the webinar series, thinking, to be successful, thinking of using that word, and I thought, well, what does it mean? It's exactly what you're saying. It's such a multifaceted thing, isn't it? Success. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I had quite a big think about it when I was writing the copy, thinking, well, it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just one part of your life; it's everything, and different bits of it, and different meaning for different people. There was one final question. Oh, you first.
Okay, one more. No, go for it.
One more.
One more.
Yeah, is there anything that risks you've taken that you've regretted that you would, obviously we're quite public here, but anything that you maybe
I've been on some bad dates. Is that
it's bad dates? That one I missed.
I've been on some bad dates. No, is there anything that I regret? Of course, everyone has regrets. Everybody has regrets, and there's things that you would redo in your head a million times over. And I have a tendency sometimes to do first and reflect later. And so oftentimes I will have a conversation. I'll be very kind of in that move fast and break things way of doing things, and then I'll come away from that conversation and I will reflect on it and go, oh gosh, did I do something wrong there? Oh, could I have phrased that better? Did I make a mistake? Did I miss something? So yeah, I don't think there's many things that I would say, in terms of risks that I've taken that haven't I think even when they haven't gone exactly as I would have hoped they would have gone, I think I've learned from them. And I think actually you have to be willing to fail at things. You know, you have to be willing to fail at things. I'm divorced, for example, so I think I'm you know, in terms of talking about personal life and things that are difficult, making a decision to end a marriage is a very big one. And I think, you know, for me, it's something that I thought about very hard, and I think some people would look at that as being a failure. So it's really interesting actually when you look at perspective and life, and you think holistically about taking risks. But if you don't react to things, and you don't take risks, and you don't make changes, then it's very hard, I think, to be happy long term in terms of everything that you do. So I do think that, yeah, of course there are things that I regret. I'm not going to tell you all of them though. So
that's a song, isn't it? No regret.
Exactly, that's true. That's no regret rien, eh? Right?
Yeah,
I'm definitely not going to sing, that's for sure. I would regret that. It's being recorded.
Oh, that's great. One person have just popped up a question about why Oxford, why not London or Ireland? Why did you choose Oxford? Going back to your beginning of your story.
The beginning of my story. So yeah, so fortuitously, my aunt is an alumni of Oxford Brookes, and so she did a master's program at Oxford Brookes, and at the time, she actually lives in San Francisco, and at the time, I was living with her because I'd just finished my A levels in Ireland, and I was working in San Francisco and taking sort of a working holiday and living with her, and the opportunity, and I just actually was really just enjoying being away from home. and I thought, actually, you know something, I'd always thought I was going to go to university in Dublin, but I took a risk, and talking to her about her experience, and that's actually how I ended up at Oxford Brookes. It was a large degree of just fortuitousness in that way, and a good recommendation from somebody. So I think Oxford as well is just a beautiful city. And also as well, I think I would have been a little bit too terrified to move to London, if I'm totally honest, when I was 18. Oxford felt like a good size and a little bit more manageable, I think, from someone from Dublin. I think if I'd moved to London, I think I might have been just absolutely terrified. But that was, so yeah, so that's how I ended up at Oxford Brookes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a beautiful city, and it's quite contained, isn't it? You can and you're near enough London. Well, thank you very much. That's been really interesting. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions, and it's been I've picked up a lot, and the audience have been sending lots of very inspirational talk and positive messages to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, my absolute pleasure.
So before we close, for the audience, we have the third event next Tuesday, which is Becky Mitchell, who's the head of volunteering at Birmingham University, and she's going to be talking on something similar, but taking opportunities, so something a little bit different from her viewpoint. And so make sure you come along if you're interested. We'd like to see you, and I'll let you get on with the rest of your evening. And thank you very much. It's been lovely, really interesting tonight, Keely.
Thank you so much, Molly, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Speak soon.